the opportunity to come and speak to you again tonight. I'd like to also start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we're meeting tonight, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. That's one change that we've had since 2006, an acknowledgement to the traditional owners, and I think that's really important. We work a lot more nowadays with Indigenous land carers and so on, and do a lot of co-learning about the environment and how we can sort of work together on protecting the environment, which is a really, really nice development over the last number of years. But anyway, when I was thinking about, well, what will I talk about tonight, I dragged out my talk from 2006 and looked at it and thought, yeah, we've done a few things since then. So I thought what I'd do is start with a bit of a timeline from 2006 to 2022, and just, it's kind of doing three things. It's kind of looking at some extreme events that have occurred over those years. It's looking at a few things that I've been involved in my career in those 16 odd years, and a few other significant events. That's kind of as context, and then I'll get more into the actual talk. But to begin with, that's my timeline. It's actually a temperature warming curve, but it serves as a timeline. Later in 2006, because I think it was June, middle of winter when I spoke to you last, Al Gore released a documentary, and my recollection is we became very busy after that time. We had councils, we had state governments, we had the federal government sort of knocking on our door wanting climate projections, tailored projections, not just for Australia but also for the Pacific, and we were quite busy. Some of us were involved in the fourth assessment report. I was a contributing author on that one. And so we were very busy, and also I was leading a project called Future Coasts, which was for the state government of Victoria, developing storm surge projections for the Victorian coastline, which kind of informed sea level extremes. So if you're doing a development, how high could extreme sea levels become? Look, I'll try standing. It's a bit lazy sitting down, isn't it? But I'll stand. Is that okay? Oh, sorry, I was getting a recording. Are you okay? Okay, cool. 2009, we had a massive shock with the Black Saturday bushfires. Really kind of surprised scientists as well with the intensity of the event, the meteorological conditions leading up to that event. It was like a furnace in the days, and the really sudden wind change that caught people by surprise and led to those devastating losses, Marysville and so on. Shortly after that, I was invited onto the author team of an IPCC special report on extremes, and this IPCC commissions regular science reports, which are updates from its three working groups: the science, impacts and adaptation, and mitigation. That's what the fourth assessment report was on. But every now and again, the IPCC will also commission a special report when it identifies topics that need further focus, and extreme events were identified as something that really needed more attention. And it was also partly awareness that the adaptation community are trying to teach us trying to guide communities on how to adapt to climate change. But we also have the emergency disaster response community responding to disasters that are happening right now. So there's a lot of connecting the dots that needed to take place. So that's part of the motivation for that extremes report. But I was on the chapter that was actually developing extreme projections. We barely finished writing finalising that report, and we had the Brisbane, and one of the things we were doing on the extremes chapter was identifying the potential for compound events and cascading impacts. And so the Brisbane floods were just a real case in point. The fact that there had been drought leading up to a La Nina event, then there was a lot of rainfall in the preceding months. That led to very sodden ground, such that one more extreme event and there was massive runoff and so on. And there was another thing playing out. Dam managers had been sort of dealing with managing the dams for drought conditions. So we're sort of allowing the dam to fill to relatively high levels. not realising that they were going to be hammered by a number of additional extreme events that took those levels up to dangerous heights for the dam design, and they had to release floodwaters at the worst possible time during a major flooding event. These were the kind of cascading impacts that we were starting to, we'd already been trying to write about in that extreme event, extremes special report. We were also very busy following the AR5 release in 2014, 13 and 14 with more national projections, more Pacific projections. And then in 2015, the climate variability switched from a La Nina to an El Nino, and we had the 2015 El Nino. That created some massive extreme events. Another example of a compound extreme was over 1,500 kilometres of mangroves around the Gulf of Carpentaria suddenly died back, and it turned out, once scientists studied it, that it was a combination of influences. So when we have a La Nina, we tend to have warm ocean temperatures around Australia. That leads to higher rainfalls. But during an El Nino, we have much cooler temperatures and much drier conditions around Australia, particularly around the north. The other thing that happens with cooler temperatures is sea levels are lower, so we also have lower sea levels around the northern continent. So three things happened that affected the mangroves. Sea levels were lower, so their root systems were more exposed, more evapotranspiration, less cloud cover, more exposure to high temperatures, and they just underwent a massive dieback. And of course that's a really significant impact on the ecosystem, because prawns, prawn larvae recruit in the mangroves. Mangroves play an enormous ecosystem service in terms of providing nursery habitat for sea life. So that was an extreme event that kind of took us all by surprise. Meanwhile, in that season, we're having another series of compound events occurring in Tasmania. So 2015 also saw a massive marine heat wave off the east coast of Australia. So the East Australian current is warming, it's moving further south, and the waters off the east coast of Tasmania were abnormally warm. That led to serious impacts on the aquaculture industry, because the oyster stock, there was an outbreak of Pacific oyster mortality disease, so it devastated the aquaculture industry that season. But also later that summer, because of the dry conditions, dam levels were very low in Tasmania, and they were sort of allowing them to get low too, because I think this was in the dying days of the carbon credits, and they were sort of selling, credits and so on. Not that they'll admit that, I don't think. But anyway, so drought conditions, fire broke out in the dry lightning caused massive bushfires in the highlands, which emergency services were responding to. But they went on for months, and before the emergency managers had put those fires out, as a result of the warm temperatures, there was a major east coast low that caused floods in Launceston. So I was really stretched between fighting fires and dealing with floods. And because of and another event, which was not climate related, but Basslink failed, so suddenly Tasmania had severe energy shortages. They had to ship in diesel generators, they had to use load shedding, so some industries had to shut down some days of the week. So that the net effect of that sequence of events was that the state's gross state product that had been anticipated to be about 2.5% was only about 1.5%. So a very material impact on the state economy. So again, that's another kind of example of a compound sequence of events that happens when you're getting back-to-back disasters, hazards and extreme events that lead to disasters. Oops, wrong button. That one. No? That one. 2015, we also saw the Paris Agreement signed, which was really good news in terms of trying to limit emissions so that we only reached 2 degrees of global warming, and aspirationally to try and get down to 1.5 because of the uncertainty of the risks that even 2 degrees of warming brings to the world. But the ink had barely dried in 2016. For me personally and my colleagues, CSIRO for some reason decided it wanted to sack us all in early 2016 because our job was done. Failing to note that in what they'd signed on to was a commitment to keep climate science going, to monitor the effectiveness of them trying to meet their Paris obligations. So we had a bit of a battle on our hands that year, but for the most part, whilst there were a lot of jobs lost, most of us kept our jobs. And in fact, later in the year, the Climate Science Centre was formed, which is a kind of a program that operates within the Oceans and Atmosphere Business Unit. 2016 wasn't done. Who can forget the major East Coast low event that occurred that caused massive erosion along Narrabeen, Collaroy, and gave us the iconic swimming pool on the beach photo that we use in all our talks. And then I was invited onto the authorship team of the Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere. And this report was commissioned because there's a lot of uncertainty in the cryospheric system. They wanted more focused attention. Antarctica in particular is a bit of a sleeper. We don't, why our sea level projections uncertainties are so huge is we just don't know. There's a lot about tipping points, crossing tipping points. Have we already crossed a tipping point that will see Antarctica continue to contribute to sea level rise? And we're talking about irreversible tipping points here, that we've already set something in motion that we're not going to be able to stop. So that report was really focusing in on some of those issues. And of course, since then, I was also leading our Port Phillip Bay Coastal Hazard Assessment that we did finish finally earlier this year, but I didn't prepare any slides from it because I think they really need to, the Victorian Government needs to formally release that. But that was developing a mapping of the whole coast of Port Phillip Bay for inundation and groundwater hazards. We had the devastating bushfires that started in 2019, started in rainforests in far north Queensland that have never burnt before, just showing how dry things had been getting, and then they spent months working their way down the eastern seaboard till they hit us, Victoria and New South Wales, by the new year. We of course then had a global pandemic, and then in 2021 we had another IPCC release, and we've got heavy rains. Gosh, I just realised the time. I haven't started to talk yet. Heavy rains. So we're just starting to see extreme events coming back to back, serious extreme events. The footprint of these extreme events is now becoming so large that we're starting to see that some of the effects of the some people have not, a lot of people have not rebuilt from the fires, and now they're being flooded. And those are the kinds of things that, if I was to summarise what's different between perhaps 2006, it's this realisation that the footprint of these events and the frequency and the intensity with which they're coming is really starting to ramp up, such that we've barely dealt with and absorbed the shocks of one before the community's dealing with another, and that's one of the worrying things that certainly concerns me about how things have changed. I think some of the changes we've seen in those years have surprised even climate scientists. We've talked about for years that it'll get warmer, and then the extremes, both wet and dry, will get more extreme, but to actually live through it, it's kind of scary, and you think, I'm not sure I really anticipated quite how it would play out, but that's how it is. So I thought I'd just now run through just some of the changes that we've seen in terms of some of the major climate variables, talk a little bit about compound events, tipping points, and some sea level stuff. That's kind of more my sort of focus area, and then just summarise. So unfortunately, greenhouse gases continue to rise. The blue curve, the bottom one, is the carbon dioxide, and then we also count the other greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone's a greenhouse gas. When you convert them into a CO2 equivalent, you get the red line. So we've already got to over 400 parts per million, and just to put that into context, that's significantly higher than we've seen over the last 8 ice age cycles. So that bottom left plot is going back 800,000 years, and you can see carbon dioxide oscillating with ice ages and interglacials. Then we get to, on the right of the diagram, we get to the Industrial Revolution, and suddenly carbon dioxide has taken off. So the paleoclimatologists have gone back further and say that's the highest levels seen in 2 million years. And unfortunately they're not slowing, and even we sometimes get questioned about whether the slowdown during the COVID pandemic in 2020 was measurable. It was, but it was only temporary, and it's kind of bounced back, so it had no long-term effect. Most of the atmospheric CO2 is due to fossil fuel emissions, so the wedge of orange is the emissions, so everything above the line is what's been emitted, and in orange is from the fossil fuel industry, in yellow is from land use change, and everything below the line is where it's gone. About a third's gone into the ocean, a third's gone into the biosphere through photosynthesis, that kind of thing, and then a little bit more than a third is just hanging around in the atmosphere. That's the CO2. Methane, disturbingly, is also increasing, so that top plot is taken from measurements from Cape Grim, Cannock, which is in northwest of Tasmania, and our lab down at Aspendale monitors gas because it's blowing off the Southern Ocean. It's very pure, and they do isotopic analysis on the gases to work out what the origin is. It was starting to stabilise from 2000 to about 2005, but it's taken off again. And unfortunately, methane is a lot more potent than carbon dioxide. On the other side, it does only persist for about a decade, so it's about 83 times more effective at trapping heat than CO2. But it's almost entirely man-made, which does mean that we can do something to get rid of it. And the major sources of it are wetlands, particularly in Africa. One of my colleagues, Zoe Lowe, was reporting on this just the other day. It's related to some of the movement of some of the wetting and drying around the Sahel Desert and so on. But if we can rein them in, and there has been a methane pledge that was offered at COP at the moment, if we can get more countries signing on, that could bring those levels down. Temperatures have continued to rise. They fluctuate a lot. As I was saying before, during a La Nina event, we tend to have lower global temperatures. That's because more of the heat stays in the ocean, but during an El Nino, more of that heat that's in the ocean tends to be released back out to the atmosphere. And it's important to remember that all the energy that the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are trapping, 90% of that excess energy actually is in the ocean. So there's a huge store of heat in the ocean that can come out during an El Nino event to warm the climate. Although there's year-to-year fluctuations every decade, if you average out each decade, every decade during the 20th century has been warmer than the last, and probably the decade we've just gone through will be the coolest decade we will experience for the rest of this century. And Australia's climate has warmed by about 1.44 degrees since records began in 1910. And so we've obviously experienced a lot of extreme events as a result. So the bottom plot just shows the year-to-year variability in orange, and the blue is the sea surface temperature, which is also increasing around the continent. Naturally, hand in hand with that is fire weather has gone up. So fire weather is a measurement of the conditions that are conducive to fire occurring. So things like high evapotranspiration, high temperatures, high wind, and so on. And if you look at the early part of the record from 1950, the first 35 years compared to the latter 35 years, the shading shows the increase in the number of days where fire danger is really extreme. So we've had, in the really dark red, an increase of 25 days where fire danger is very high. And that's affecting most of the southeast of the continent. Rainfall, even though I know we're experiencing floods, southern part of the continent is currently experiencing, or has been experiencing, a net decline in mean sea level, mean rainfall. Now that's not to say extremes don't go up. It's just the overall trend has been downwards. Heavy rainfall events are becoming more extreme, and that's just down to fundamental physics, thermodynamics. For every degree of warming in the atmosphere leads to a 7% increase in the holding capacity, moisture holding capacity of the atmosphere. So there's more water up there that can then condense into rain, and that's why we're seeing these much more extreme rainfall events when they occur. The oceans are changing. I mentioned about a marine heat wave off Tasmania in 2015-16. That's a plot just on the top left diagram, but there've been other marine heat waves occurring. Some of them, particularly in the east, are driven by meteorology, like blocking highs that can trap the warm waters from the East Australian current. In the west, they tend to be related to La Nina events and the Lewin current extending further south. But that's driving changes in the ocean. We're seeing biozones migrating south, so that's sort of different species moving further south to escape to find a place they're more adapted to. And we've had 3 mass coral bleaching events since 2010. Before that, they were relatively rare events. The other thing that's happening in the ocean, as I mentioned, about 30% of all the carbon dioxide that's going to the ocean, into the atmosphere is being absorbed into the ocean, and that's making the oceans more acidic. And so the combination of effects is really stressing certain types of organisms, such as corals, causing them to bleach, weakening them. This acidity weakens anything with a calcium structure, like corals, shellfish, foraminifera, that kind of thing. So those two effects are having a definite effect on the oceans, and it's being measured now in corals, the actual weight of corals and things like that. They're losing weight. But, yeah. Sea levels have continued to increase, and they're now accelerating. Back when I last spoke, there was a lot of debate, are they accelerating or not? Our models told us they should be increasing, but the data didn't confirm that at that point. Well, it does now. They are accelerating. They're currently rising at an average rate of about 3.5 millimetres per year. And the dominant cause of that is anthropogenic climate change. So what the diagrams here are showing is that effectively the tide gauge record is the blue, and the satellite altimeters, which measure sea surface increase, shown in the orange, and they're only available from 1993. That's when the altimeter satellites came into circulation. Now, it's not uniform. As I've said, when we have La Ninas and El Ninos, we see a difference in the ocean heights, particularly in the northern Australia, and we also see higher sea levels off the east coast of Australia, and that's related to the stronger gyre circulation, which leads to the East Australian current, which is now pushing further south and taking a lot of warm water. So we're sort of seeing a dynamic response to that increase in sea levels along the eastern seaboard. Future changes in temperature. Now, all of these diagrams are coming from the State of the Climate report that we and the Bureau of Meteorology put out every 2 years. This is from the 2021. I was hoping to use the figures from this year's one, but it won't be released till next week. It's still under embargo, but messages are basically the same. We've only got 2 more years of data, but it's still trending in the same direction. But one thing we can do now is we can go back to the projections. As a bit of a reality check, we can go back to the projections we were putting out back in 1992. And that bottom figure there, the orange wedge, is what we were saying the temperature trajectory would be, and the jagged line is the observations since then. And you can sort of see that, yes, we get year-to-year variability that we can't predict with our models, but we can predict the overall trend, and then the uncertainty envelope kind of captures the year-to-year variability. So that helps us to build confidence that our climate models are doing the right kind of thing. So this figure shows where we're heading. The blue is the climate models run over the past period, or the ensemble of them, the whole collection of them. So the whole shaded blue area is like all of the climate model results. The line is the observations and the black line is the mean of the observations. So you can see that with the exception of the 1950s, the climate models replicate the observations pretty well. There's a little bit of a hiccup in the 50s where there was a lot of unusual climate variability that the climate models aren't capturing. But the orange is the future, and it's just going out to 2040, but just showing that we're sort of still on that upward trajectory, and we will continue on that upward trajectory under all emission scenarios, pretty much to 2050. And then, depending on whether we limit our greenhouse gas emissions or whether we keep on business as usual, there will be a sort of a separation. So the aim is to try and keep to 2 degrees of global warming. We're currently on a trajectory to 3 degrees of global warming because the commitments made by countries signing on to the Paris Agreement don't go far enough to stop us. How are we going for time? Am I taking too long?
No,
Oh.
I don't think so.
So just to summarise, I don't want to present a lot of numbers. This report is online, anyone can look it up. But temperatures will continue to rise, sea levels will continue to rise. I'll talk more about sea levels in a minute. Marine heat waves more frequent and intense, warmer with more heat waves, fewer cool days, fewer tropical cyclones, but when they occur they can be more intense because of the rainfall issue. Cool season rainfall decline in the south, heavy rainfall to become more intense, and longer fire season and more dangerous fire weather. So that's kind of a bit bleak, but that's our future. So I did just want to touch on sort of, I mentioned before about we have a lot of concern and we're trying to unpack and understand compound risk and cascading impacts, and this is sort of what we did in the IPCC. It's not the SROC report, it was actually, yes, that's right. So one thing, so there are a lot of factors. So like sea level rise isn't an extreme event, it's a slowly changing event, but it can exacerbate an extreme event. So events can be preconditioned, and it's a bit like the 2010 flooding in Brisbane. The ground was sodden because of a very wet preceding season. It was already saturated, so there was no more absorption for another extreme event to go in, for the soil to take up any more rainfall, and then it all turned into runoff and exacerbated the flood. So preconditioning can be really important. They can be multivariate, so you can have multiple events. Think of the Tasmanian event. You had fires and you had floods all happening at the same time. Spatially compounding, where you have hazards in multiple connected locations that cause aggregated impact. Again, the Tasmanian event, all sorts of things going on impacted on the gross state product. And that the societal impacts, increased frequency of severe climate impacts. The community has barely picked itself up again before it's hit by another extreme event, and that can lead to eroding resilience of communities. So these are all the factors that play into it. We summarised it in the figure on the right, which is compound risk is fed into by the extreme hazards, which are the tropical cyclones, the floods, the fires, whatever. The exposure, so how much of the community or the environment is in harm's way, and the vulnerability, how vulnerable is it to those effects. Those combine and they can cascade back down into the socio-economic processes and back down into climate processes. We're also really worried about tipping points, and this is another topic that's really taken off since the early days, and we can start to address better with more sophisticated models. And there are a number of potential worrying tipping points in the climate, some of which it's not clear that we haven't crossed already. And these are things like a slowdown of the meridional, so I'll just focus on the global ones which are in the top diagram. So we've got Arctic winter sea ice melt. Quite forgotten where, I think by the end of this decade it's expected that there'll be that the Arctic winter sea ice will be almost entirely gone. We've got Antarctica, the instability of the West Antarctic ice sheet that can lead to a lot of sea level rise, but also we've always thought East Antarctic was pretty stable, but turns out we're seeing some signs in the East Antarctic continent that shows warming from below because of the warm ocean temperatures that could start to destabilise things in that region, and the ice sheet itself. So there are three kind of tipping points in the cryosphere. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulations, it's a big current that goes up the Atlantic. It takes warm water into the European region. That's why the climate there is quite hospitable. South of England's quite relatively warm. But that's slowing down, and that can lead to really rapid temperature drops, and it's often fluctuations in that have led to some of these mini ice ages over the period. And that would not be good for Europe at all. The Amazon, Amazon dieback, and that's not even counting the loss of the Amazon because of human clearing and so on. They're the lungs of the earth. Permafrost collapse is a worry because if you get massive melting of the tundra up in Siberia and further north, it can release a lot of methane back into and carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere that is currently frozen in that tundra. So these are the sort of tipping points that there's a lot of focus on. I'm not an expert on it, but these are the sort of things that are why the Paris Agreement came into being, because we don't want to get to those really dangerous levels of warming that could trigger some of these, because they're self-reinforcing. It's a positive feedback loop once they get strongly underway. Unfortunately, we're already about 1.1 degree above pre-industrial global average, and even though there are massive emission cuts, we'll reach about 1.5 by the 2030s. So we've already kind of locked in the 1.5 degree warming, and our current pledges, unless they're ramped up significantly, will see us getting to 2 to 3 degrees of global warming. So I'll just talk quickly about rising sea levels. So sea level rise is caused by a number of factors. So thermal expansion, as the ocean warms up, it expands and so rises. Melting of glaciers around the world, and also the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland. And even a small contribution from changes in water storage. So back in the 50s and 60s last century, there was a lot of dam building. You're impounding water on the land. That actually can contribute to a small sea level fall. Even the floods of the 2010, scientists could measure a slight dip in global sea levels because there was so much water on the land. It's probably the same now. But we don't build so many dams anymore. But now what we're doing is pumping groundwater, and that's making its way back to sea. So whereas the terrestrial water storage was a sink, it's now a source, but a small one. The main ones are thermal expansion and melting of the cryosphere. Sea level's not level though, and there are other factors that contribute to how much sea level rise any coastal area will get. Weather and climate patterns, so high pressure depresses the ocean surface, low pressure draws it up. Ocean warm and cool currents, so the bottom diagram shows one of my colleagues' modelling of sea level rise, sea levels around Australia by 2100, but you can see that whilst it's all positive, you get relatively more sea level rise on the eastern seaboard because of that effect of the East Australian current being particularly warm. And the other effect is change in gravity. So as the major ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, well, currently they exert a gravitational pull on sea level, so that the sea level around the margins of those ice sheets is somewhat higher, a little bit higher than the rest of the oceans. But as they melt, the gravitational pull weakens, and that causes a readjustment, and the readjustment ends up increasing the sea level on the opposite side to those masses. So the Australian Pacific region is kind of on the opposite side of the world if you think about West Antarctica and Greenland. So we're talking a few centimetres, it's not a lot, but it does contribute. It's one of the factors that when we're developing sea level projections, we have to take into account all of these physical processes to develop regional sea level rise projections. So what did the last IPCC report indicate for sea level rise? Well, because of the role of Antarctica and a slightly better understanding of the role Antarctica will play, up until now it's always been considered a sink because precipitation over Antarctica was higher than the melt, but it's now starting to contribute positively to sea level rise. And there's concern that some dynamical processes could kick off, like ice sheet carving and so on, that will ramp up the contribution this century, but probably not to lead to more than about the range for the high emission scenario is up to 1.1 metres, although the IPCC was saying, well, look, we can't really rule out it couldn't get to about 1.6 metres. But the concerning thing is really not 2100, it's the future's, it's further out into the future. There's a lot of inertia in the oceans and in the cryosphere. By 2300, the uncertainty is huge, but if we stayed on a business as usual emission scenario, the estimates are anywhere from 2 to 7 metres of sea level rise. Now I know that's a long time into the future, but we do worry about that because of the potential of sort of setting off, crossing tipping points that can't be, we can't pull back from. If we do manage to keep global warming to about 2 degrees, then we may only be seeing in the range of 0.5 metre to 3 metres by 2300. And that's the thing with sea level, we can't actually stop it. It's just such a slow process that it's already sort of underway. Sea level rise at the moment is because of greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere decades ago. I'm just going to really quickly run through this. So when we talk about extreme sea levels, there's a lot of factors. We've got the tides, storm surges, waves, seasonal factors like El Nino that I was talking about, and sea level rise, and some local factors like subsidence, land subsidence and so on. I'm going to skip these because I've been talking too long. In terms of weather changes around Australia, what we're seeing in the climate system is an expansion of the tropical bands. This is pushing some of our weather systems further south. So, for example, the cold fronts that hit the south coast of Australia in general are moving further south, and this is why we're seeing projected rainfall declines. But that could be a slightly good news story for storm surges along the south coast, except that, let me just skip forward, wave climate is changing. So as we expand the tropics, we're compressing the westerly wind band around Antarctica. That's making the winds speed up. That generates higher waves. Waves propagate unattenuated over the deep ocean and reach our southern coastline as swell. So whilst we might see slightly fewer or slightly less intense cold fronts, which generate our storm surges, we will tend to have much higher swell impacting the coastline. And we'll also see a directional change in the waves, and that's important when you're considering coastal erosion and so on. And of course, we know from the channel deepening that more swell can get in through the heads now, and it's kind of thought that reflection of the steeper channels is why that very rapid erosion was occurring at Portsea. These are some of the impacts that we see. We see inundation, we see groundwater changes as that freshwater saltwater lens moves further inland. We can see groundwater actually breaking the surface and becoming inundation. We can also see backflow effects when we get high waters on the bay and our drainage systems don't cope, and so we see upwelling and in the streets and flooding. We also see overtopping of seawalls and yes, erosion and swimming pools where they shouldn't be. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I thought I'd prepare this as a summary slide because I often get asked, I'm always giving depressing talks, and then I think, and people ask, do you have any hope for the future? And I sort of decided to get in early and think about this. And I do because in that 16 years, back in 2006, we were dealing with the climate deniers that were trying to tell us that it's not even happening. I really think that there's an enormous number of, there's a real groundswell of awareness around climate change now. We've got renewable energy. I was talking to one of my colleagues today about all the offshore wind that's being proposed and so on that could, if it all went in, it would probably completely energise Victoria. You know, so there's a lot going on in the renewable space. There are policies to finally tackle the transport sector and decarbonise it. Greater imperative, or unfortunately we've got global conflicts which are, some of which are a consequence of climate extremes. The uprising, the Arab Spring uprising is believed to be sort of triggered partially by sort of harsh climate conditions caused farmers to not be able to grow crops. They immigrated to the cities. That put stress on city infrastructure. It created social unrest, and whenever we've got people displaced, that leads to unrest. But when we've also got this horrible war going on in Ukraine, which is so senseless to me. But one thing it might do, hopefully, is not in the short term, whilst Europe is trying to find any kind of fuel to get through the winters with the shortages, but accelerate weaning off fossil fuels. Let's hope so anyway. And the private sector is really rising to the challenge and so on. Also, the COVID crisis did show us how quickly the world can respond, so that sort of makes you think, well, we could go even faster. And I'm often surprised to hear what is going on, to the innovation, the technological advances that are going on. Really good initiatives around reducing and recycling, innovations in adaptation and building resistance, including working with nature. And we've got a youth that I think is way more motivated and way more educated now, that I interact with a lot through work, and it's really, I'm in awe and really admire their efforts in this space. So I do have hope. I know that we're not going to reach some of our targets, but it is really encouraging to see so much more uptake of the need to do something. So I kind of wanted to end on I didn't want to end on a downer, so I thought I'd put together a slide on some of the positives I see out there. I'll leave it there, and thank you very much. Any questions?